invitation to talk about these important issues. As my esteemed colleague mentioned, I am a professor at Washington University. I teach in the School of Public Health and the School of Law. But prior to that, I was able to serve as the senior coordinator for gender-based crimes and crimes against children here in the ICC Office of the Prosecutor, and then also previously to that, special advisor to the prosecutor on sexual violence and conflict. So that gives you some sense of the focus of my remarks. I'm going to talk about sexual violence in particular, and in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is a place where I've spent some time over the years, and again, it's very close to my heart. I'll focus my remarks just on the current situation, which is dire. It is a nightmare, as many of you know, with the control rebel groups of the M23 have taken over the eastern part, North and South Kivu. We're seeing heightened levels of violence that are shocking. I think even though the news in my country doesn't cover Eastern Congo very much, unfortunately, I think everyone in this room is probably quite aware of the heightened crisis there at this time. There's a lot of violence happening. There's, of course, still use of children in the conflict, as some colleagues just described. I'll focus on the sexual violence piece because it is not just about the conduct, but also the long-term consequences, social, psychological, physical, of this act that poses challenges for response. In early 2025, when M23 captured Goma and Bukavu, there are, of course, many attacks reported against civilians. But let's focus on what we learned about attacks on children in particular. UNICEF measured that children constituted 35 to 45% of the 10,000 reported cases of rape in the region between January and February. This means that during the most intense phase of the fighting, the estimates were that a child was raped every 30 minutes. It was women and teenage girls, of course, who were primary victims along with some of these children. In January and February 2025, there were 74 reported cases of sexual violence and 34 cases of forced child marriage in Netway, Salamabila, was reported by Action Aid. And then for the first half of this year, and this is where we have numbers running into the thousands of victims reported in South Africa. The children, of course, were swept up in much of this violence, including the forced marriage, which was sometimes characterized as marriage, quote-unquote marriage to fighters. But also in the context of displacement, we see often that children are married off for their own protection by families that are afraid they can't support them, or might lose them in the chaos of displacement. So you see not just the cases of rape, of course, and sexual mutilation, but marriages, so-called marriages that are happening for violent purposes and also protection purposes. We also have reports of sexual mutilation, accompanying rape in many cases, and other forms of sexual healing, other types of sexual humiliation. So, and there are other forms. I won't go into detail because it's quite grim, but I think that if we're interested in this topic, we have to imagine much more than rape as part of the repertoire of violence. This includes forced sexual acts, some reported cases of forced incest. This is a way of humiliating and destroying a community, of course, and breaking it down. Cases also of attacks and disemboweling of pregnant women, which has many meanings, many harms, of course, attended, but is one way of course, destroying the community. Remember that rape is the one form of violence that can also produce children. And so we have the added complexity of children who are born of rape in this context. And that poses the question of how well a society is constructed to support those children who may be unwanted by their mothers and have no status really in the society to which they are born. And this is an emerging area of consideration. We have grappled with this at the court, actually. I saw this, of course, in the facts of the online case. But we see this in many contexts, and it is a challenge for civil society and for states, and of course for their communities themselves. Attendant to all of this violence, of course, is mass displacement. As the M23 is moving, people are moving from the rural areas into the cities and sometimes onward. I think the current estimates are almost 500,000 people internally displaced, 400,000. And this, of course, displacement leads to ongoing and increased risk of exploitation because of distance from the normal community resources, lack of protection of your home, your networks. In addition, as people move into areas they're not familiar with, it becomes more difficult to look for care, to seek medical services, for example. At the same time, the hospitals that do exist and are functional are overwhelmed by the surge in patient requests that they have, and they themselves can be under attack by armed groups. So what does it mean to take a survivor-centered approach in a context like this? It's hard to imagine providing basic services, much less doing it with the care that's required to call yourself survivor-centered. What does it mean anyway? It means that in the provision of services or any interaction, we put the survivor's needs first and take their viewpoints into account with all decision-making. It ensures, in this case, that survivors of gender-based violence are seen as individuals and are treated with dignity and respect to the extent possible, given agency over every interaction with them. Leave them as much decision-making as possible to decide what care they receive and how they receive it. This is not, let's be realistic, any of us who have worked in conflict situations know that there is often very little room for accommodation when we are hard-pressed and have limited resources. So this is the goal. Part of that is taking a trauma-informed approach, which I know we talk a lot about in our work, but what does it mean in the context of emergency? When not only the survivor may be traumatized, but the healthcare provider, the lawyers, the law enforcement may also be suffering different types of trauma from the surrounding conflict. Essentially, it means being aware of trauma and how it can manifest, how it can affect an interaction, how it affects someone's help-seeking behavior, how it affects how they tell their story, how it affects how we conduct ourselves in the court of law to make it possible for them to speak to us. This is the awareness that we all need regardless of our role. In the DRC, with respect to sexual violence, part of being survivor-centered and trauma-informed means understanding the full impact of the brutal forms of sexual violence we're seeing. Not only the physical and psychological impacts of rape, for example, but the stigma that follows it. Serious physical, psychological, and social consequences of maybe the genital tearing or the fistula that result. Lawyers were not trained in fistula. I spent a lot of time with medical providers and healthcare providers. It is very common as an injury in Eastern DRC and other parts of the world where the injury sustained in the genital region creates incontinence. This can make someone excluded from their community because of how difficult it is for them to stay clean. And this can cost them their marriage, it can cost them their home, they're moved outside of their home often. And it sounds simple and irrelevant to our work, but it is deeply, deeply important. Because this impedes their ability to seek help. It impedes their ability to access community resources and protection. And the violation they've suffered never becomes surfaced in inquiries because no one talks to them, because they are not there to find communities of victims who participate in the legal process. They are, as colleague has mentioned, often invisible and impossible to access because of the results of stigma. We also see upticks in rates of transmission of sexually transmitted